Morning, everyone. Oh, good afternoon. What am I saying? Thanks for coming along to the August meeting of the Injury and Disability Data Insurance Data Interest Group. I'm Michael Decato, the group facilitator. Just a reminder, today's session is recorded so that we will post it publicly for people who can't make it today. What is the Injury and Disability Insurance Data Interest Group? Just a quick reminder, it's our regular opportunity for people with an interest in personal injury and disability insurance data to share knowledge, exchange ideas and learn from one another. We aim to meet bi-monthly. We're meeting in August. Our next meeting is on the 5th of September with a guest speaker. We're from the Healthy Working Lives Research Group. We conduct a few programs of research in systems recovery and in prevention as well, with the idea that good work is good for health and good health is good for work. Today we'll be hearing from Associate Professor Jason Thompson, who's with me here in the room. Jason is an Associate Professor in the Transport, Health and Urban Systems Research Laboratory at the Melbourne School of Design. Here he focuses on the translation of research into practice across the areas of transportation, urban design, safety, public health, post-injury rehabilitation, public policy and health system design. Associate Professor Thompson is a previous Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Award Fellow and a current ARC Future Fellow. Among other roles, he is Chief Investigator on the current NHMRC Centre of Excellence in Compensable Injury After Road Crashes. His future fellowship is focused on using methods from computational social science to help inform the management and operation of Australia's $60 billion injury and disability social insurance compensation rehabilitation systems, including TAC, WorkSafe.
It just keeps going.
That was quite a long sentence. Thank you for that. Fantastic. I'll stop sharing my screen now. If you just want to...
Yes, Mark.
Yeah, your one.
I just need to be able to. I don't currently have a link to the meeting. Sorry.
I just
2 seconds.
Email you on for 1 second. Thanks for your patience, folks.
There we go.
Recording in progress.
Is that audio? Is that? And that's okay. Yep, great. Okay. Hi everyone. Sorry for that brief delay. As Michael said, my name is Jason Thompson. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne's Transport, Health and Urban Systems Research Lab. I'll give you a bit of background in a second. I'll just want to share my screen though, which is here. Great. And here we go. A little bit about me. I've only really been in academia, I suppose, the last 12 or 13 years or so. Maybe that's, and before that I was in injury system design. I was in service design. So I first started off as a clinical psychologist, trained as a clinical psychologist. And was always in disability service design, essentially picking up jobs where no one really ever, say funding might have come from government. And they said, look, we have this idea about what it is that we want to achieve with this. There was a huge gap between what the intent of the funding might have been and what the outcome was supposed to be as well. So they were always looking for someone who sort of said, okay, well, right, well, how would we do this? And I was always silly enough to put my hand up to sort of say, okay, well, I've got a couple of ideas about how a service could be designed to achieve the sorts of things that you're interested in doing. So I come very much from that implementation side of things. especially in disability service design. Hence my interest in compensable injury, injury insurance systems, NDIS, WorkSafe, TAC, etc., etc. I spent a bit of time in commercial research. And then spent a bit of time also in a media company, which was quite strange because I wanted to get a sense of what things were like in the for-profit world. But thanks to the GFC 2008 and 9, all the media company collapsed, and that allowed me to go back to research, which I've been in ever since. I did my PhD when I was working at the TAC using TAC data, and most of the roles I've had over the years have been about translating research into practice and from practice into research as well. Always. Or playing that middle role. And I know we've got a fair few people online today, and I was hoping that we could have a bit of a discussion, if you like, more than a presentation from me, because I wanted to. There's a few times when I've talked about the way in which you use modelling in insurance schemes, and the value that I sort of see in computational modelling of insurance schemes. And that always rubs up a little bit against, I suppose, data as well. And this is a live sort of issue for us for work that we're currently doing with a few agencies around the place. We have systems that we're trying to understand. We have data that comes out of that system, and there's a lot of time. We sort of assume that, well, if we just get all the data from the system, then we'll be able to understand the system. And I suppose I don't always agree with that position. And we're sort of saying, well, what are we missing from the data that we get? What's the completeness of that data? And a lot of my research is in complex systems research, which is about the interrelationship between data and the interrelationship and feedback mechanisms and the messiness, if you like, of the real world. So I want to pick up on a couple of themes of that throughout this presentation. So again, this is a little bit about me. This is I currently have an Australian Research Council Future Fellowship, which is focused on the sustainability of Australian social insurance schemes and the conditions that might lead them to fail. So we might think of schemes that are either in trouble at the moment through financial trouble at the moment, or schemes that have been in financial trouble in the past. Sometimes you see those troubles or those failures unfolding, but often they just sort of, as the saying goes, someone goes broke slowly and then all at once. So what sorts of things can we look out for, which would mean that we have schemes that are teetering on the brink of possible collapse or wholesale change, as we've seen in interstate as well. In the lengthy sort of introduction, which I should have cut down before I send it to Michael, he talked about me being a computational social scientist. Now, what is that? So again, my background's in psychology. My PhD was in medicine, but most of the time these days I use computational methods to try to reconstruct systems and the way in which they work. And the idea behind that is that if we can faithfully reconstruct a system and the way it works from the knowledge that we can, and the data, if you like, that we can get from insurance systems, then we can create what you may have heard in the, which is popularly described as digital twins of those systems. Now, digital twins really are, they sort of come more out of engineering than anything else, but I don't mind the term because it allows people to sort of get a sense of what it is that we're talking about. If we talk about agent-based models or system dynamics models or something like that, you have to spend a long time explaining it. But digital twins of a system, people seem to be able to get their heads around, and that's good for me. So a digital twin of the system is really a computational representation of what's happening in the real world. Now that might, and the advantage of creating digital twins of these systems is that we can it not only describe what's already going on. So we don't want these models to just look backwards and tell us what's already been going on, but we want to play out scenarios of the future. And if we can, and this is, you know, some people would argue that it's very, I mean, it is very difficult to predict the future, of course, but what we want to do is use these digital twins to play out scenarios that create the circumstances that might lead to collapse, or might lead to, well, maybe it's going to lead to a great outcome. But what we're looking for are the ways in which these very complex systems come together and they create the conditions that might lead to risk into the future. So we mostly use agent-based models. Stepping back, I suppose, a higher level, we use system dynamics models. And then conceptually, we would use causal loop diagrams. So we tend to go in that order. When we're constructing a model for a system, an insurance system or something like that, we'll start with a causal loop diagram, which helps us to understand what all the factors, what all the players in a system are, how they affect one another. And that's really a very qualitative research exercise where we're trying to extract from people's minds what's going on in the world, how they interact, who they interact with, frequencies, etc., and what the effects of those interactions might be. And then when we want to parameterize those causal loop diagrams, then we will convert them into system dynamics models, because then we can sort of say, okay, well, we have an insurance system here, and in our causal loop diagram, we might have simply said, well, the more people you have coming in to the system here, the more costs there are over here. But we would say, okay, well, when we went in a system dynamics model, we would actually specify how many people are coming into that system. So that's when we start to need to go out to the systems or collect information from other sources to parameterize those models. A little bit about system dynamics models when you're trying to use them for understanding your own system. They're very useful because they can explain the behavior of a system that might be going well or otherwise, you know, quite well. But they're also good if we think about it in terms of data, because, so for instance, we did a project recently trying to look at the allied healthcare workforce in Australia that was going to be required to meet the needs of the aged care workforce or the aged care sector in Australia over the next 10 years. Now, yes, we started off with a causal loop diagram. We saw where everything was interrelated. That was great. Then we started to construct the system dynamics model, and people said, okay, well, you need the data for this part, that part, that part. You end up populating your system dynamics model with the data. What you quickly realize when you do that formal exercise, though, is that the data is wrong somewhere. You don't know where the data is wrong somewhere, but something about one of the data sources that you have collected, which the person who's produced the data source is saying is valid, verified, whatever, has to be wrong somewhere, because you will end up with 130% of people in one part, 180% of people. You'll end up with 5.5 million sort of people spread across different, because there's been double counting somewhere or other. So the beauty of system dynamics models is that they're at once quite transparent, but it also points you in the direction of where your data is possibly wrong as well. And so for researchers, it's a good sort of test, because if you ever hear a statistic about, I don't know, there are X thousands of people who require this service every day or something like that in isolation, that a good test of whether that is correct or not would be to join that figure that you just heard up with all the other figures that or that you have access to, and see whether it actually plays out in the system. So system dynamics models are very, very good if you have data in different pockets which hasn't previously been linked up before, or you want to test you want to test the robustness of the data that you are collecting from whether it's the insurance system or some other part of a system that you're interested in analysing. The other thing about computational social science is that the models you create, especially from the agent, from whether it's from the causal loop diagram or through to the system dynamics models and through to agent-based models, is that they can be very, very good for visually demonstrating to people how a system works and what the consequences of decisions might be. So even if you have, there's great discussion in the literature about toy models and I suppose validated models. So computational social science, or you can quickly generate a toy representation of a system. We're talking, anything from hours to weeks. The difficulty, of course, is when you want to validate that model and someone wants to get a point estimate on perhaps what an outcome of pulling a particular policy lever within that model might be. And we tend to drift always towards that level of specificity. There's always someone in the room who wants you to get very, very detailed data about a specific item. So, for instance, we often get asked to do pedestrian models of, let's say, it's a hospital system or something like that. And we've done one recently of Melbourne Airport. And what people have in their mind when they ask you about what that model should look like is often, it's a visualization of the airport, it's a visualization of the intake area of a hospital, people moving around, that sort of thing. So people are represented as real people, and you might, as you might see them in a video game sort of stuff. We try to avoid doing any of those sorts of models because they're always wrong. As soon as you start to create a model which has really, really high levels of specificity, it will be wrong to begin with. And someone else in the room will say, look, that desk that you've got pictured over there, or this chair over here in the corner, that's not there anymore because, Barry came and took it away, so people can move through that space now. So it just becomes super, super difficult to validate those sorts of models because they're always wrong. So if you're thinking about building models and using data for building models using agent-based models or system dynamics models, work out very early on the level of abstraction that you're interested in getting to and the purposes of that model. Is it to understand the system, or is it to get a point estimate on exactly, how many people are going to be, moving through one part of the system at any particular time, and get agreement around where you all sit at that. But I would also sort of say the abstract models generalize better, okay? So if you have a very specific model, which is, of a particular place or a particular system, of course, no one outside of that system, if it's very specific to that, is going to sort of see much use or interest in that. But if you raise the level up a little bit, and you can have more of an abstract model, which demonstrates the relationship between factors that are generic across systems, then that will be obviously a more generalizable model. And that's the sorts of work that we're trying to do at the moment, where we understand that, insurance systems generally have a kind of structure. There's either an injury or an illness or something like that. There's an assessment process. People come into the system, they move around different parts of that system, and, hopefully they either get better, or if they don't get better, there's timing of them leaving the system, and there's rules and regulations and that sort of thing. But there are general principles, and there are general principles of insurance systems that we can kind of learn from and can be instructive across systems. If we create a model that's too specific, doesn't generalize well, doesn't work well. So, and and often, you know, when we build these models, people want them to be, you know, useful for decision making. So important in the model is also that you leave some parameters kind of free, that you can then a policymaker or someone who's interested in system design might be able to manipulate. So we can sort of see what might happen under different circumstances. Now, the other thing I'd sort of say is you know, we in the work that we do, we have a range of people who come from the academic purist sort of side of things, and you know, got very mathematical sort of bents and want evidence for everything before we make any decisions around anything. And then we've got people who are sort of in the business of real world application as well. And you always have to find some sort of medium between those two things. So, and my argument, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, maybe I'm just justifying the way I do things, is that people in systems are still going to make decisions anyway. And so it's up to you to be able to create a model which is reasonable enough and has enough information in it that allows them to make a better decision than they would have before. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if it nudges them in the right direction, then that's probably a good outcome. So the question is, how is your model or how is your representation helpful for influencing decisions for the better? If you provide people with, let's say, you know, 9 different policy options or something like that, and you can get them to stray away from the, you know, from the worst 5 of them and sort of say, look, you know, business as usual is here. If you do these ones over here, we expect it's going to be really bad, or you're going to risk the health of your system. Just nudge yourself, or if you can just be on this side of any of these decisions, we would sort of say you're doing quite pretty well. And if you're constantly, you know, iterating over more and more over to the better side of the decision, then that's great. The things I really love about agent-based modelling for social science and for systems analysis, it's very exploratory. It enables you to combine data and theory. So I know a lot of the people who are on the call are very data focused, but data and theory can come together in agent-based modelling for social science and systems analysis. Again, as I said before, it points you in the direction of evidence gaps. Sometimes you can witness the behaviour of a system, of a modelled system, but you don't know how it's being created, and you know that you haven't collected that data in the real world. So it points you in the direction of where to go and get that information in the real world. It can understand both micro and macro level phenomena within the same model. And by that, I mean that the performance of a system that you model is not necessarily just the aggregation of all the behaviour of all the individual agents. In fact, that would be a very, very boring model if you just sort of scaled up what was happening at the micro level for individuals and that just reflected the top level. That's not what they're about. They're about the way in which people interact, and that small differences at the micro level can lead to big differences at the macro level. They can often produce surprising results. One again, you know, one of the things to stay away from in these sorts of exercises are boring models where you already know what produces the phenomenon. So often these models are best when they provide a surprising result. It might be surprising about the way in which particular agents that you have constructed behave in a model. It might be about the way in which the total system operates when you have decided that all of your individual agents are acting optimally. Maybe individuals acting optimally kills the entire, you know, performance of the system at a macro level. You don't know. So the surprise is really important and makes things interesting in these sorts of representations. However, it does make it quite difficult to plan what your model is going to be, because to begin with, it's almost like you should not know. You know, Richard Feynman would talk about science being, you know, you shouldn't really know what you're going to get before you get it. And I would kind of agree. That does make it difficult, though, to tell other people what is going to happen, because you can't tell them ahead of time. It also allows you to mock up toy representations quite quickly. Your system, the system that your model can run over time, so you don't need to get snapshots. Often when we're collecting real data or even time series data, we only sort of see glimpses, but you can get the full behavior of a system if you recreate it in an agent-based model, and you can record the data that you want to. They can include limitless heterogeneity, and I want to talk about this in the last little bit. How long have we got to go? 10. Yep. Okay. So I want to talk about issues of generation and heterogeneity. We'll touch on those in a second. I just want to ask people to sort of think about these things, and people will also always sort of ask you about the validity of your model. Totally reasonable question. Is your model valid? How do you know that your model is valid, especially if you're projecting into the future? But the thing that I would, and the convenient answer that you can always sort of give here is that if you've created an agent-based or a system dynamics model, or especially agent-based model, you have to code in the way in which it works into the model. So it has to be transparently coded in computer code. So you can point to it and sort of say, well, I think this system works like this, and I think this is the way in which people interact, or something like that. So the question of validity is really, well, I can write my model down in terms of how I think it works. So if you're contesting the validity, you have to also better define what the mechanisms are that you think are working. So it becomes a contest of the way in which people think the world works at that point. And the great part is, in agent-based modeling, and we have this in real systems when we work with people, is if you can put switches in your model. So you have a model that works under, the Michael model, and then you have another, if we can't agree, we've got Elizabeth's model over here, and we can put a switch in there, and we can sort of say, okay, well, this time we're going to run it under the Elizabeth assumptions, and this one under the Michael assumptions, and we can sort of see how it plays out, and we can see which one of those fits reality better, and have a discussion about that. So you're always going through this inductive deductive loop, which is good science. And also everyone always wants to use these models for prediction, but there's a great article called Why Model by Joshua Epstein, 2008, and he describes 16 other reasons other than prediction to do agent-based modeling. And I would agree with this. It's for explaining phenomena. It can guide data collection, as we've talked about. It can illuminate the core dynamics, to discover new questions, promotes the scientific habit of mind. You're testing things, you're experimenting. I think, my least favourite sorts of research is when we just go and collect data and then we describe it. And then we say, oh, we need more data. And so we go collect it and we describe it again. I'm really into experimentation. I want to manipulate variables and I want to see what happens. So I think be critical of public health at this point. So, but I think sometimes in public health, we collect a lot of data and we describe it and we don't have not much after that. So I think that this sort of exercise allows us to have an experimental role in public health as well. We can also use them for crisis response. In 2020, we provided modelling for Victorian government about how to get out of that second wave of COVID modelling. So you can tailor it so that it's policy relevant as well. And the problems with existing models at that time were that the sort of classic epidemiological models, they were sort of projecting from, a slope that we're already on and projecting sort of 7 days in advance. That's not very useful for government. The government needs to know what is generating that behaviour and how that might play out over months. So that's why the models that we built were specifically policy models, not just epidemiological models. And I'll pick up on that in a second. Right. I'm just going to go through here. Right. The other thing about, especially in insurance systems, is that we can, if you can create a representation of an insurance system, you can drive it to collapse multiple times, and it doesn't matter. It's a safe, low-cost environment to do experimentation in. You don't. All we did was learn about circumstances and learn about whether something was realistic or not. So if you can, and similarly, if you can generate realistic crises and failures within those systems, you can also implement, computational synthetic solutions to those things. So you can, again, go through these sort of policy scenarios of, well, if we see this happening in the real world, that might tell us that this system is going to collapse in this or that kind of way, and then we can implement this kind of solution, and this might provide an answer for us. So you can test all of these sort of scenarios ahead of time. Of course, there will always be unknown unknowns, but you're probably going to know about more of the unknowns, through this kind of method than simply going through things in your head, because the real world is far too complicated for our brains. So the interventions that you can implement can be useful in the real world as well. So I guess I've been reading a little bit about risk curves lately, and I suppose these are just questions that are sort of striking me in insurance and areas of risk and things to think about that I'm happy to have a discussion about. I suppose one of the things in psychology is that the first statement there's always a sort of, it's a bit trite, but the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour. Now, I suppose what I want to do with that quote is to have a think about that statement versus the second statement, which is the best predictor of future performance is past performance. And I suppose what I want to make a real distinction between those two statements. Besides always being trotted out at the bottom of any superannuation ad about best predictor of future performance is not past performance, I think the thing to note there, and the thing that computational social science does, is that it links behaviour to performance, okay? So if you have a system that is performing in a certain way and you are only looking at the outputs of that, of the performance of that system, and you don't know what the behaviour that is generating that performance is, you don't really know what's going on. So I would say it's much riskier to make an extension about the future performance will match past performance if you don't know what is generating that behaviour. And what agent-based models do is they create interactions that generate an output, okay? So a classic example would be reproduction numbers in epidemiology. They're often used as an input into, trying to understand how a disease might spread through a population. But really, in an agent-based model, they are the output of the way in which people interact. So, if you had a reproduction number of, let's say, 3, what you're really sort of saying is under normal circumstances, anyone with this particular disease will, pass it on to 3 other people. But that's the outcome of their behaviour. So the difference between perhaps what it is that we did in some of our epidemiological modelling as well is to sort of say, okay, well, the reproduction number that you have is that performance criteria is the result of behaviour. It's not the input that you just sort of use into the model and you forget about what is producing that. So always be careful that in any assessment of, sort of data that you're seeing, the performance that you're seeing in insurance systems or that sort of thing, you understand what is generating that output. You understand what is generating that data. So don't just rely on the data itself, but understand the processes that are generating that. That's kind of, it's really important. And there's a saying in agent-based modelling, if you didn't grow the phenomenon, you haven't understood it. So you need to be able to create that phenomenon in your models in order to be able to say that you understood it. It's not just having the data is not enough. The next one is really about, I suppose, understanding what it is that or understanding a phenomenon, I suppose. So if I put a million, I think that's a million to the power of a million cats in front of a computer, and one of them punches on the keyboard and produces the entire works of Shakespeare, what do we know about that cat? Well, given that we had an extremely large number of cats, it might be that, okay, well, that cat got lucky, okay? And so we can say that occasionally in these systems, we have lots and lots of people coming through these systems, and occasionally some of them will produce a really weird outcome, or they'll be, a really, really strange person going through the system with a particular, a unique profile. But that's very different. What we know about that cat, it just got lucky, is very, very different to if we just put 5 cats in front of a computer and one of those cats produces the entire works of Shakespeare. So, we only had 5 cats in the second one, and so it's like, oh, actually this cat, that was really unlikely because our sample was much, much smaller. So we know more about probably the second cat than we do about the first cat. And we would have much more confidence that the second cat would then go on to produce, the Iliad than we would the first cat. The second cat, we know slightly more about it. So be thoughtful about the sample size that we're pulling from when we see any phenomena in systems as well. I suppose the last thing, I'll just, is there anything in here? I'm just aware of time. So yes, just going, if you haven't grown a phenomenon in a model, it really sort of, I don't think you've explained it. So often in agent-based models, people come from disciplines where they just want to plug in a number into the model. Oh, well, the relationship between that and that is that. So no, we have to produce the mechanism that grows the relationship that you're describing. That's when we understand what's going on. So if you can't explain the behaviour or the performance or how the performance comes about, you're potentially blind to important mechanisms that will throw the behaviour and performance of the system around. So you need to understand what generates the behaviour. So computational models of interacting agents, so agent-based models, are very useful for testing and generating these behaviours. You create a virtual world in which agents act under various regimes and see if you can regrow the behaviour of interest. And this is particularly true in complex systems like insurance systems. They have a high degree of interrelated inputs and outcomes, feedback mechanisms, etc. And I've already given the example of R. And just to finish off, I just want to talk very briefly about, or just really sort of question more about distributions and thinking about distributions and the way in which we should think about them, and I suppose the crossover between more clinical sorts of work that we tend to do in health and social sciences and real world systems, if you like. So, let's say we've got a couple of distributions here. We've got a normal distribution here, and we've got a gamma distribution there. And most people, yes, they're acting normally, but we've got a few people out in the extremes. So we've got, roughly, let's say we've got 3% of people out in, sort of past or a couple of standard deviations. So we've got a very small number of people outside in those tails. Now, and then what we tend to think about, let's say this is so we've got those distributions. Then we've got these sort of, let's say you had a risk curve where the behaviour of a system, where if people were on one side of the curve, it didn't really make much difference, or extreme behaviours didn't really sort of make much difference to the way in which the system operated. But on the other side, it was asymmetric, right? So you had really, really bad outcomes from a couple of people who were acting sort of uniquely badly or in this sort of way, right? What we tend to do in clinical work and lots of work is we get rid of the outliers in our samples. We look for unusual things. We look to see if they're unusual. And we get rid of them out of our samples. But in real world systems don't have the luxury of getting rid of outliers, right? And if you've got a system that is extremely affected by outlier behaviour, whether it's through costs, whether it's through time spent on that, whether it's through legal changes that need to be made because of that outlier, whatever it is, it's really important that we don't discount outliers because they often drive the behaviour of the system and they will disproportionately drive the behaviour of the system. So if we put these sort of two different things together, what I suppose the message that I really want to sort of say here is that agent-based models and computational social science appreciates both the generation of behaviour and weirdly, it can often produce populations that are more representative of real-world populations and all of their vagaries than can the real-world clinical studies that we rely on for data, because we've got rid of anyone in that population who is problematic. Okay, so we've got rid of people with head injuries, we've got rid of people who non-English speaking background, we've got rid of people who had multiple injuries or dual diagnosis or whatever. But often we have to appreciate that those outliers often drive the behaviour of the system. So that's the last thing I want to leave you with, the fact that, you know, we're talking about these synthetic societies, we're talking about computational models of systems, and we think about them as just models and not the real world, but sometimes they can actually be more like the real world than the real world that we think we're dealing with through the data that we collect. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic.
There you go.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jason. We'll open it up now if anybody has any questions from the audience. Just feel free to unmute yourself and let us know who you are, ask a question. And if not, I might start off. That's all really fascinating. The use, I've always enjoyed hearing about the use of computational modelling and so forth. One question I had was, I suppose it's for our more industry folks on the call. Are these models based on, I'm sure they're based on research, but is it publicly available research, or is there a proprietary aspect to any of this model?
No, so there are some proprietary platforms out there, but all the good ones are not. So, so it's all open. It's all based on publicly available research and or publicly available knowledge that's been gathered from systems themselves. So there are different protocols. There's sort of an argument an ongoing argument in agent-based modelling and computational social science at the moment about documentation of models. So, for example, the COVID model that we created a couple of years ago had 12,000 words worth of documentation. And I would argue, and because we were doing it kind of right, but I would argue that that's not useful either. Okay. So the transparency of models is really, really important, because they're really, they can become super, super complicated and complex because they're trying to reflect the real world, but they are often non-transparent too. So even though everything is explicitly written down and you have to point to exactly where it is that you've got the data which is justifying your decision to do that sort of thing, or identify where you're not confident about this relationship, or the distribution over which you're sort of pulling the relationship from, they still remain quite difficult for people to understand. So a lot of our work is in trying to make them easier to understand. That's not that easy. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's it's good to hear that it's all open source and so forth. But as I'm well aware, very complex to develop some of these systems. And I suppose on that, how, for example, with the model that was developed for COVID, how long is the process of building a model like that? Are there bits that chop and change from other models?
Yeah. So I'm not a software developer, but we have people on our team who are, and they're always talking about modularity. So you have parts of your model which are interchangeable. Let's say there might be the geospatial part, or it might be about the disease mechanism or something like that. So so you separate these parts out. So if there's new information that comes in, you can separate that, and the rest of the model remains sort of stable. So there's different ways of constructing them, but the process is, as I described to PhD students, stuff like, your thesis is never finished, it's only abandoned. Or I think I say the same thing about albums, they're never finished, only abandoned. So, and models are the same, and we create models that are current versions of the phenomenon we're trying to describe. And that's why they often live on GitHub repositories and that sort of thing, because they're in their current state. And I suppose the fact that they're not static is a strength. Okay, fantastic. Well, we are running out of time. I'll just check if there are any more questions. I've got a question here from Zoe. Have you done modelling for workers' compensation insurance schemes? And if so, what was the most interesting finding in relation to factors influencing outcome? Thanks for that question, Zoe. We have created a model which we published a couple of years ago, which was based on the Victorian Workers' Compensation Scheme. That was a pretty process-oriented model. I think that the thing that was most interesting about that was about the limitations of the construction of that model, which didn't really take into account changing external circumstances in the population as well. So, so I think that the thing for me was that model, and this is a bit of an academic answer, sorry, the question was in the construction of the model. And when you had a very tightly constructed model, it fails to often pick up on a lot of the problems that emerge in the real world, because it's too tightly constrained. It wasn't about the outcomes of the model itself. It was about the process of working with the scheme to create the model. If you ahead of time you're too tight with the way in which it should be set up, then you don't learn much, because most of the time you think, okay, well, we already knew that anyway. Yeah. Okay. There you go. I hope that answers your question, Zoe. We might leave it there. We're just running out of time this afternoon. Thank you, Jason, for joining us today. It was fascinating. I'm just off camera here, but I am here. If you would like to present at a future meeting of the Injury and Disability Insurance Data Interest Group, please just shoot me an email. We'd be more than happy to hear from anyone, but we'll leave it there for today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.